Chapter 8. Tawnos. The newcomer arrived unannounced at the Palace of Artifice in Krug, capital of Yosha. It had been a long journey from the southern coast, and he was bone-weary from his travels. Had he been sensible, he would have bedded down for a day or 10, paid for a suitably tailored gown, and then called for an official appointment through established channels. However, the newcomer was unschooled in the ways and practices of high Yoshan society, and presented himself directly to the palace, his letter of introduction in the vest pocket of his traveling cloak and his gift in a satchel slung over his arm. The Palace of Artifice was a separate wing of the royal palace itself, flung off from the main buildings in an eruption of new construction. There was no one to receive the traveler at the main doors, which surprised him slightly, but there was no one to block his entry either. Indeed, there seemed to be a steady flow of clerks, librarians, and petty officials milling about, but nothing that looked like an armed guard or even a helpful guide. He stopped one of the clerks, a round, friendly-looking fellow with an armload of scrolls and vials. This individual explained that the chief artificer could be found in the ornery, the central domed workshop at the back of the palace, and that the visitor could reach it by going up the stairs toward the rear, right at the first intersection, left at the second, rightish but not too right at the star-shaped one, down one more flight, and there he would be. The clerk never asked why the tall, blonde-haired man was looking for the chief artificer in the first place. The friendly clerk's instructions also left something to be desired. It took another 15 minutes, and 2 more helpful clerks, for the traveler to finally locate the ornery, which was, as promised, a large dome-shaped structure mounted on the back of the main building. The newcomer noticed that the circular roof of the building was built on a sliding pivot so that it might be unbolted and moved to one side. Within the ornery was a form of controlled madness. Along the far wall was the frame of one of the fabled ornithopters, frozen in mid-explosion. Each of the pieces was mounted separately, with inscribed lines showing what piece fit where. A group of young students stood along one side with trundle-operated lathes, gently shaping candlewood spars. Along the other side, an ornithopter was in the midst of construction as another group of young people stretched canvas over the wings. In the center, standing over a huge table littered with plans, was the chief artificer. His hair was pale blonde, almost white. While shorter than the newcomer, he commanded a presence that made him seem much taller. 3.4 inches to the first flange, shouted the chief artificer to the lathe workers, who dutifully pulled out the calipers and began measuring. No, no. He stalked over to a crew assembling the ornithopter. Place the skin over the lead grommets along the wing first. That will allow the wing to unfurl naturally. As the newcomer watched, another clerk elbowed his way past and handed a scroll to the chief artificer. Urza scanned the paper for a moment, shook his head, and made the clerk wait as he returned to his paper-covered work desk. He pulled out a stylus and quickly edited the message. "And tell him I need the supplies by noon tomorrow," he snapped impatiently. "No later." The clerk pushed his way past the newcomer and back into the main building. Suddenly the visitor noticed the woman standing alongside one wall. She stood so still among the pandemonium that the traveler at first thought her a statue. She was dressed in a simple blue gown, and her lustrous dark brown hair spilled over her shoulders. Her arms were folded in front of her, and she wore an expression on her face that hinted she disapproved of the entire scene around her. "Excuse me, miss," said the newcomer. "I was wondering if—" The woman turned, and the newcomer choked on his words as he recognized the full lips, the dark, fiery eyes, and the fine lines of her face. At once he realized whom he was addressing and managed a gargle. "Your Majesty, forgive me." He was well on his way to the floor. His knee had just touched the hardwood when a soft hand touched his shoulder. "Arise, young man," said Caleb Krug, Princess of Yosha and wife of the chief artificer. When he looked up, she was smiling slightly, as if his manner amused her. He felt the blood rush to his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "I had no idea who you were. We don't stand on much ceremony here in the lair of the chief artificer," returned the princess. Out on the main floor of the dome, Urza was bellowing at the lathe workers. "I said 3.4, not 3.2. I need a tolerance no more than 0.2 for these struts." "Is your HUSB?" The newcomer stopped and began again. "Is the chief artificer free at the moment?" "I can't tell," said the princess with a catch in her voice. "I've been standing here for 10 minutes waiting for him to notice me. If I have to wait 15, I usually assume that he's too busy." The newcomer looked at her face more closely and nodded. "Perhaps it would be better to come back tomorrow," he ventured. The princess laughed a tired laugh. "This is about as unbusy as he ever gets. Is it important?" The visitor reached in his coat pocket and pulled the envelope from its hiding place. "I'm his new apprentice." Kayla opened the letter and scanned it quickly. The newcomer held his breath as she did so, fearful she might find some impropriety within the letter of introduction that would prevent him from even talking to the mighty Urza. "A toy maker," she said. "At last." "From Joralan, on the coast," said the young man quickly. She nodded. "We summered there when I was girl, and it got too hot even for Krug." "Well," said the traveler, "I've been making toys there for the past few years, full journeyman and everything. People thought my work was fairly impressive, and they suggested that I apply to be one of his apprentices." He let the statement trail off with an embarrassed shrug. It had sounded so logical back in Joralan, much more logical than it did now, explaining to the most powerful and beautiful woman in Krug. "I see," the princess said, and that amused look returned to her face. "His apprentice." "One of them, anyway," said the traveler. "Please," said the princess. "All these are not apprentices. They're drones, toiling around the king bee that is Urza. Assistants, students, extra sets of hands, that's all. Apprentices have higher demands put on them than this lot. They usually don't last more than a month at the outside. He's a hard man to keep pace with and a very demanding man to work for." As if to prove her point, Urza let out another shout. "I said I needed 0.2 tolerance here, lathe number 1. Are you using some number system I'm not familiar with?" There was laughter among the younger lathe workers as one blushing youth returned to his machine. "Perhaps I should come back later," repeated the newcomer. "No time like the present," Kayla responded. "He'll be just as bad tomorrow, and I won't be here to help." "Urza, husband. A moment, please." The chief artificer responded to his wife's call by holding up a single hand. With the other he held a stylus, checking the long column of figures. He did not look up. "Of all the," muttered the princess, several decidedly unregal lines appearing on her forehead. "I swear he spends every living moment working until he is exhausted. Then he wakes in the morning feeling he's fallen 6 hours behind schedule because of sleep." Urza. The hand stayed up, and, as if to show he was listening, waved back and forth a little. "Perhaps this will help," said the visitor, reaching into the satchel and pulling out his gift. What he produced looked like nothing more than an inanimate hunk of rope of chain. He flicked a switch at one end of the chain, and it suddenly stiffened and struck forward. It was a snake, suddenly come to life in his hands. Kayla jumped at the transformation. The snake leapt across the open space as if on invisible wings, landing among the papers littering Urza's table. It burrowed among them, emerging directly beneath the chief artificer's notepad. It raised its head, rattled its tail, and rasped a hissed warning at the Argivian scholar. The entire ornery went dead silent. The lathe stopped, the students wrestling with the wingtips froze, and Urza paused, stylus in hand, regarding the snake's fang-filled mouth. Then he leaned forward and tapped the snake's snout with the end of his stylus. It rang out with a hollow sound, and the serpent immediately curled into a small coil. The chief artificer looked up, a broad smile on his face. "Who did this?" The newcomer blushed. "That would be me." Kayla stepped forward with the letter of introduction. "This is Tawnos, a toy maker from Joralin. He wants to become your appren." Urza did not let her finish, but took the letter from her hand and said, "Toy maker. And that is one of yours?" "One of them," replied Tawnos. "Why wood?" asked Urza. "Metal would be a lot more long-lasting." "Wood's lighter," answered the younger man. "And yarrow wood produces a more natural sound for the snake when it moves. Metal versions tended to clatter." "So you tried it," said Urza, his eyebrows raised. "Good. That's very good. Spring-driven, I suppose." "Clock mechanism," said Tawnos. "I was told you worked as a clockmaker." "For a time," said Urza abstractedly. His hands were busy examining the snake, probing, bending, pushing. "Then I retired to join the government. Less heavy lifting." Kayla began. "Darling husband, my father is expecting," but was silenced with by an upraised hand. "It's very lifelike," the artificer observed. "Did you study snakes to make it?" "We have a lot of coastal snakes," said Tawnos. "That one was based on a kind of viper found along the coast. I made it for my own amusement, as a kind of practical joke." Urza. Kayla began again, but was completely forgotten by the chief artificer. "What about birds?" asked Urza. "I've been trying to improve the lift ratio of the ornithopters." "It depends what you want," said Tawnos. "Soaring birds like gulls or even vultures might be inappropriate as models for ornithopters. I should think you want ones that can launch quickly from a perch, like predatory owls and other raptors." Urza's face brightened, and at that precise moment Tawnos knew he had secured his position. "I had not considered that," said the blonde-haired artificer. "I always considered a bird to be a bird, regardless. But you are correct, form follows function, and function determines form. Here, take a look at these plans, and tell me if I have a soarer or a fast launcher." Tawnos looked over the papers littering the desk and inhaled deeply. There were all manner of ornithopter plans, showing different wing configurations and positions. Some of the machines resembled things he had seen in nature, while some looked as if they would never fly under any circumstances. Suddenly he remembered the princess who had been trying to get 2 words in edgewise as he and Urza talked. But when he looked up from the plans, she was gone, and Urza was shouting at the lathe workers again for greater precision. The princess's heels were shod with metal and always sent a message as she moved across the palace's polished marble floors. Sometimes it was a leisurely tapping, reassuring the staff that Her Majesty was thinking as she walked. Sometimes it was a slow, methodical clack, which usually meant she was walking with someone else, usually some official from the hinterland who was getting a local tour. And occasionally it was a skipping staccato, produced by her, and much less common now than in the times before she was married. The message being tapped out at the moment was a warning. She had just been to see her husband, the Argivian artificer, and was not happy with the results. The stern rapping of metal on stone was enough to send the most hardened courtiers fleeing in terror, and to cause even the most experienced servants to reverse their directions and quietly back up the way they came. As a result, Kayla had empty halls and full thoughts as she stalked along the way leading to the drawing room. She fumed as she walked. He was busy. He was always busy. Given sufficient resources, he would devote all his time to his projects. The ornithopters, the metal statues, the great plodding beasts that had suddenly appeared one morning in the rose garden. He would work until exhausted, and he would work everyone around him to the same state. If she did not send a guard for him, he would sleep in that ornery of his. Sometimes she did let him sleep there, but that did not slow him down. Of course, her husband was not the only guilty party here, she realized. Her dear father was just as much a cause of her husband's neglect, always asking for something new, some special favor for this baron, some particular device for that temple, something to make one guild or another's life easier, a new way to haul water, a new way to harvest crops. And of course the chief artificer could not refuse his warlord anything, particularly if it was excused to develop some new device. It was a perfect match. Urza liked to build things, and Daddy liked the things Urza built. It didn't matter to the warlord how Urza created his wondrous devices, and Urza never thought about what her father wanted the devices for. All of the scheming left Kayla alone. She stopped and stamped her foot hard on the stone floor, causing several of the hiding servants to wince and wonder if the mark she left could be polished out or would require replacement of the stone. She took a deep breath and tried to calm down. Actually, she told herself things were not as bad as they might be. The ocean people, after a brief period of concern about the warlord's new son-in-law, quickly warmed to Urza. The wedding helped win over the common people and most of the merchants. The minor nobility was vastly relieved to see that Urza did not care for political power beyond the limits of his work table. And the temples. Well, the temples were a small problem at first, despite the supposed enthusiasm at the wedding itself. Argivians were nastily irreligious, and the devotion of various gods, real and otherwise, was a major political consideration in Krug. Not to mention the fact that all the assembled religions were keenly aware that they themselves had had the chance to admit that Urza the Argivian into the temple schools but had turned him away. Because of his heritage, things were a little problematic for the first few years. What with the churches all waiting for some misstep or announcement from Urza that would trample on one group or another's beliefs, Urza himself provided the solution to that potential problem. First, by staying in his workshop, he provided little provocation to the temples. Second, he managed to wrangle from the Jalam tome a small bit of old Thran science on the temple's behalf. It was a simple device, a small amulet with a sliver of active power stone mounted on its back. It emitted a low-pitched hum that served to keep the wearer calm, and in doing so provided a modicum of protection. Naturally, anything that smacked of the healing arts was snatched up by the temples, who immediately pronounced Urza to be a wonderfully fine fellow, even for an Argivian. So the temples were happy. The merchants were happy when more people flocked to Krug, hearing of their magical amulets. And the common folk were made happy by merchants hiring more help, and by the ornithopters that were now seen flitting among the towers, attracting still more people to Yosha. And Kayla told herself Daddy was happy because he had metal statues, ornithopters, and wonders others did not have, and a son-in-law who delighted in making more. In fact, Chief Artificer Urza was making everyone was happy in Yosha except its princess, his wife. To make matters worse, Daddy had mentioned to her that he did not have a grandson yet, an heir to carry on the title. Was it her fault that the warlord kept her husband continually occupied with other matters? Kayla knew there were other options for intimate companionship, of course, but she had always found them distasteful. When she was growing up, the matron had all manner of stories of queens and princesses who dallied with some handsome young courtier or kind-hearted commoner. But most of those stories were cautionary tales that usually ended with one or both of the two people involved dead or in exile. Somehow it did not seem like a good set of choices to her. But she was still young and beautiful, and there were those who looked at her in a fashion that her husband did not have time for. It was nice to know that one could turn heads, she reflected. Kayla was sure that the tall, brawny toy maker from the coast had almost swallowed his tongue when he finally recognized her. It was little things such as that made her feel good. She thought about the newcomer, Tawnos. He was tall and broad-shouldered. She had no doubt he had drifted into craft work after spending his youth hauling in the sardine catch off Joralin Point. His blonde hair was in continual disarray, giving him a lost puppy dog look. There was a man, she thought with a smile, who was in need of a good young woman to put his life in order. And his manners. Pure hinterland. You could even hear the gulls when he talked. Under court tutelage, that would change soon enough. Of course, from the start Tawnos seemed to have developed a rapport with her husband. If her husband was sometimes unreachable by her, he might listen to a man who spoke in the language of inventions, devices, and science. Kayla shook her head. Part of her wanted to see the handsome young newcomer survive the grind of working with her husband. Tawnos seemed like a nice young man. But part of the princess knew that if he was to fit into her husband's world, he would have to alter to fit Urza's needs. She had learned that if one did not fit into his plans, one was simply ignored. She was walking slowly now, her heels a soft tap against the marble. The courtiers knew that the storm was over, whatever its cause, and she passed several of the servants who bowed briefly. As they carted fresh linens, silverware, more of the inevitable. Scrolls about the palace. Finally she reached the drawing room, took a deep breath, and entered. The Privy Council was already meeting. Her father, the warlord, was already there, hunched over one end of the long table. On his left hand was Roscoe, who had arrived at the palace with Urza and showed no sign of ever decamping. Indeed, the clockmaker had become the semi-official liaison with the merchant guilds in Krug and would only part with that title and the perquisites included when either he or Krug was no more. On the right side were the captain of the guards and the seneschal. The captain had been the warlord's squire back at the dawn of time, but had aged less gracefully than her father, and in fact spent most of his time napping. The seneschal looked much as he had on her betrothal day. Probably his own frantic nervousness prevented any illness or misfortune from getting within 20 feet of him. The three men we daddy's closest advisors, and herself, of course, always welcome and always paid attention to. The four of them formed the warlord's privy council. "Is he coming?" asked the warlord sternly. "Is he ever?" replied the princess, trying to keep a bright tone in her voice. "No, he's wrapped up breaking in his new apprentice." The warlord looked a question at Roscoe, who merely shrugged. "A new one to me. I'd bet this one lasts a month at the outside." The princess took a seat next to Roscoe. The clockmaker used to burble in the royal presence, but that had diminished and finally stopped some years before Kayla realized she missed the fawning just a little. "What is the situation along the sword marches?" asked the warlord. The captain of the guard sniffed and stifled a sneeze. Kayla always noticed that direct questions caused the old man to sneeze. "Steady," he mumbled. "The fallacy are getting more and more brazen with each month. There's talk that one of the tribes is gaining control over the others." "Another tribe besides the Tomikul?" asked the seneschal nervously. The captain fought off another sneeze, then replied, "The city fallacy are token heads, and I've heard that even they have agreed to go along with this new desert clan. Usually the tribes of the deep desert spend most of the time raiding each other. Except now," said the warlord. "They're raiding more caravans now, or demanding exorbitant tolls," added Roscoe, "or in some cases, caretaker fees for additional caravan guards they provide. It's extortion, sucking the lifeblood out of the merchant class." "And our patrols?" inquired the warlord. The captain pinched his nose. "We have 3 companies along the marches. Once a caravan reaches Yoshan territory, it is safe. There have been no raids into Yosha proper at all. But we don't have enough men to accompany every caravan across the desert." "What about the ornithopters?" asked Kayla. That question evoked a full-fledged sneeze, followed by a handkerchief produced with a flourish and a loud blast to the nose. "We could send them along with the caravans," the captain said at last, supporting Kayla's suggestion. The warlord shook his head. "I wouldn't want anything like that falling into the fallacy hands. How about using them to patrol the marches?" The captain blinked hard. "We could. We don't have enough of them right now." "Why not?" demanded the warlord. The captain looked as if this query would produce another sneezing fit, so Roscoe came to his aid. "The limit is not in raw machines, or even in young men and women foolhardy enough to want to fly them. The problem is power. The ornithopters run often. Old Thron device, a power stone. The metal statues do the same. There aren't a lot of them in Yosha. Urza has been working to try to mend broken power stones, but it's an iffy job. We can build all manner of ornithopters, but they're just pretty kites without the proper stones. That's problem number one. The warlord grunted. Any place else we can get more stones? The seneschal spoke up in a meek voice. The Argivians have collected a large number of stones over the years, but they use them for their own devices. And they're scouring the desert for more. I understand. There was a pause. Kayla could see the wheels turn in her father's head. Whenever he started thinking like this, the result was normally trouble for someone. Captain, he said finally, I want you to send exploration parties into the desert. They will carry descriptions of the stones so they know what to look for. We'll ask Urza about the most likely places to find them. This last was not a question, so the captain nodded in agreement. But what if our parties meet Argivians looking from the same stones? Squeaked the seneschal. They'll probably be relieved to meet other civilized men in the desert, as opposed to those Phalange fanatics, snapped the warlord. But just to be sure, I want you to frame a letter to the Argivian king. Tell him what we're doing, but frame it in terms of mutual defense, all of us against the savages in the heartlands. That should calm him down enough. Anything else? Roscoe spoke up. One thing, Your Majesty. He produced from beneath the voluminous folds of his vest a small dish and a bottle of black powder. With the chief artificer's successors, you have decreed that we keep our eyes open for other devices, either in old books or the marketplace, that could be used by Krug to better protect itself. I think I have something that may be useful. The former clockmaker laid the dish on the table. Into it he poured a small amount of the black powder. The powder was crystallized into small spheres and reminded Kayla of shriveled peas. Roscoe then rose and lit a taper from a nearby oil lamp. He touched the lit taper to the crystals, and they popped and burned brightly, setting up a cloud of noxious smoke that hung over the table. That was too much for the old captain of the guard, who already had his kerchief over his face. The seneschal looked as if he was about to bolt for the door. The warlord waved a hand through the cloud. Goblin powder, he grumbled. What of it? Goblin powder, agreed Roscoe. Also called dwarven fire black, or black dust, or burning bright. It's a chemical concoction that the goblins and dwarves of the north use, and usually blow themselves up in the process, commented the warlord. Kayla leaned away from the table in search of clean air. Because it is volatile, tricky, and temperamental, replied Roscoe. It's hard to use because you have to be close to it in order to light it, and if you are too close when the fuse burns down, you get blown up. It is used in small amounts for children's poppers and other noisemakers, the seneschal ventured, but it has no practical use. Said Roscoe, holding a hand up. What if you could set a fuse and throw the powder at an enemy before it explodes? Or, better yet, if you could fit the container with a flint that causes a spark when it strikes the earth. Sounds temperamental as ever, said the warlord. You'd have to drop it from a great height to create such a spark. If you drop it from a wall, you blow up your support in the process. Rasko nodded. And if you dropped it, say, from an ornithopter? There was silence around the table. Then the warlord started to chuckle. And the enemy could not throw it back. Yes, I like that idea. I have your permission to investigate further, then? Asked Rasko. Yes, said the warlord, still chuckling. Yes, you do. Oh. And don't tell Urza about it, at least not yet. If he can't show up for the meetings, it serves him right. The seneschal sniffed. At least it will show him that others have good ideas. Agreed, said the warlord, slapping the tabletop with his hand. Then we're adjourned. We have a lot to do, and we should get to it. But by that time Kayla was already halfway to the door, seeking to escape the stench of the burning powder, her heels clicking rapidly against the stone. Chapter 9. Ashnod. The invasion party was stalled outside the walls of Zegon, and Haja knew Mishra well enough to realize he was worried. But Mishra would not tell the Qadir about his concerns. Nor, for that matter, would Haja. In the last few years the Qadir had grown to manhood, and not all his development had been good. The eager young man who was interested in Argivian folktales had blossomed into an overweight tyrant. He was pampered by his tribe and supporters and appeased by the tribes that now followed the Suwardi. No one said no to him. At least no one survived to say no a second time. What was once petulance had now transformed into foul-tempered rants. What once was eager bravery was now foolhardiness. He had become fatter than his father ever had been, but was still convinced he could lead battles himself. His mood were mercurial, his responses violent. As the Qadir grew more tyrannical, Mishra grew more popular among the Suwardi. The former slave knew how to speak to the Qadir in such a way that he could present the most unpalatable options and escape with his head still attached to his body. The Qadir's war captains noticed this first, then the courtiers, and lastly the chiefs of other tribes. Soon those with bad news or new plans visited Mishra first for his advice and aid before speaking directly to the Qadir. For his part, Mishra was open and welcoming to a people that had held him as a slave so recently. He was well versed in desert lore and legend and always had the correct analogy, the right words, and a ewe of nabbers handy. But he always made clear his advice was based upon what was best for the Qadir of the Suwardi. He crossed the Qadir directly only with greatest reluctance. Early on there was little need to argue with the Qadir at all. There was a moment of wavering among some of the tribes, the Thaladin in particular, when word spread that the old Qadir was dead. But such rumblings of independence were drowned by the greater rumblings of the dragon engine now possessed by the Suwardi. Early on the young Qadir made it a point to visit the main clans of each of his allies, strong or weak. Each was in turn impressed by the power of the great metal beast. Some preached that it was a sign from the old ones themselves, a demonstration that they favored the Phalangi in their attempts to keep the desert free of such invaders as the Argivians and the Yotians. This despite the fact that the old Qadir and a number of good Phalangi warriors had all perished in the dragon engine's initial attack. Similarly, tribes now regarded the young Qadir as the ruler of the Makfarwa, handily ignoring the fact that it was really the Qadir's wizard, his Argivian raid, who controlled the beast. But Fallagy logic was simple in this regard as well. The outlander wizard might control the beast, but the Qadir controlled the wizard. The Suwardi soon discovered that only the Raki could control the great dragon engine. As soon as he passed the power stone to another with great reservations and only on the Qadir's direct orders, the dragon engine reared up on its hind treads and threatened to run amok. As a few such experiments, the gem was put permanently in Mishra's hands, and those in the tribe who knew of it were informed the gem would stay there. Mishra could put the beast to sleep while he rested and make it respond to his slightest whim. Indeed, Hajar noticed that soon no real words were spoken between the Raki and his mechanical servant. A gesture or a nod was enough. The Suwardi conquest of the deep desert was not entirely without incident. A group of hotheads from the Thaladin clan tried to ambush the Qadir's procession. The main part of the caravan retreated before their assault, and Mishra unleashed his dragon engine among the young riders. 15 died, including the Thaladin chieftain's son, without loss of a single Suwardi. The Thaladin submitted soon afterward. After solidifying his position in the eastern desert, the Qadir looked west. Onion Dome Tomekul was the center of Fallagy power, its greatest and oldest city. Mishra said he was more concerned about Argivian patrols along the eastern borders and the increased activities of the Yotians to the south. In reality, Hajar knew he wanted more time to study his marvelous creature, but the Qadir would not be dissuaded. The party headed west, toward the capital. Time was of the essence, the Qadir said, in order to counter any plans made in the halls of the Tomikuls. Many palaces. He need not have worried. Tomikul was as rotten as an old fruit, waiting for the slightest tap to split apart. In many ways, the city dwellers were more like Yotians than Fallagy. They were preoccupied with wealth, money, and caravans. As long as the Qadir promised to not interfere with the daily lives, they were quite content to open the gates to him. The Qadir accepted the tribute but would not enter the city. Instead he camped beyond their walls in the shadow of his great beast and made the city folk come to him. Hajar and Mishra had gone into the city. They found it beautiful, incorrupt, wondrous and diseased. Here trade routes from the Saranth to Krug converged with those from the eastern coastal nations to Tarizia city farther west. The last was no more than a legend to Hajar, a city of scholars far to the west, who traded with the desert folk for artifacts and old tales much as the Argivians had. The city was a brightly colored cavalcade of different peoples, dwarves from Sardia, holy men of distant Gix, and Minotaur mariners from some far-off islands. There were warriors in zebra-hide capes from Zegon and furred traders from the Umok nation in the shadow of its great glacier. Yotian merchants trod the city streets as well, visibly nervous among the celebratory Fallagy. And there were other folk wandering the narrow byways, who defied identification of homeland or race. But in the end Hajar and Mishra retreated to the desert to confer with the Qadir, though Mishra strongly urged his chieftain to push on toward the west of this reputed city of scholars. The Qadir determined they would move south instead. To Zegon they would go, he said, to the place that shared its heritage with the Fallagy and was rightfully part of their shared empire. Mishra argued, but in the end the Qadir made it clear the matter was closed. And now, mused Haja, they were stalled outside the capital city of Zegon, with 500 men and a mechanical dragon. Worse, the dragon was misbehaving. It was a simple matter. When they got within a half-mile of the capital, the Makfar was stalled. It simply refused to proceed any farther toward the city. It could move to the east or west or back up, but it would not come any closer to Zegon, and no amount of mental commands, hand motions, shouting, or hitting it could convince the mechanical beast otherwise. The Qadir, not one to be denied, was apoplectic. He wanted the beast looming before Zegon's front gates when the city surrendered. Instead, his armies were within sight of the city's whitewashed walls but could advance no farther. Haja could see the city guard lined up on the battlements of the outer wall, spears in hand, almost taunting the Qadir's armies. Some of the spears had skulls on their points, no doubt some additional Zegoni taunt Haja was unfamiliar with. The only thing the Qadir's forces could do was make the best of a bad situation. The dragon engine began a long, slow patrol around the perimeter of the city, keeping the half-mile distance that seemed to hold it at bay like a physical wall. A message was sent to the leaders of Zegon, calling to their attention the power of the dragon engine and demanding the city's immediate capitulation. The Zegoni sent back a terse note that they would consider the Qadir's offer and he was welcome to wait while they made up their minds. That defiance did not improve the Qadir's mood. That evening, in his tent, he railed against his captains and in particular against his Raki. "Why can't you move it any closer?" he thundered. "We don't know why," answered Mishra calmly. "Why don't you know?" cried the Qadir. "Because you have demanded we run all over the continent, impressing the other tribes," thought Haja. "Because we have not had the time or the resources to study the beast other than what hurried sketches we can make while moving from place to place. Because it has not been a priority for you until now." Haja wondered if Mishra was thinking the same thing. Instead, the Qadir's Raki said, "It could be many things. Possibly there is something about the city itself that keeps us at bay. Or it may be something about the nature of the Makfar war. There may be some item the Zegoni have that's affecting the engine. We don't have enough information to be sure right now. The question is, do we press on or do we fold our tents and abandon Zegon, contenting ourselves with the riches of a united desert nation?" The Qadir slumped back into his pillows, and a serving girl bathed his head with a damp cloth. He ignored her and said, "You have traveled through this land. It is rich in timber and metals. It is properly part of our empire. Its people are Falagi in origin, as much as the Tomikul were," thought Haja. Indeed, from what he had seen of the Zegoni, they were much like the city-dwelling Falagi in their mercantile outlook. He wondered idly if all the coastal nations had some unknown means of stopping the dragon engine, and how the Qadir would react if that were indeed the case. The Qadir was still talking. "We go on. We patrol with the dragon engine. We start leveling the smaller towns beyond the half-mile radius. We drive people into the capital, panicked people who tell of the monster that lies waiting beyond the gates. In the meantime, we send messengers back to Tomikul to gather more warriors. We'll assemble enough to break down the walls if need be." Haja thought the plan represented the waste of a better part of a year, but if any of the war captains agreed with him, they remained silent. A few advisors had argued loudly with the Qadir. In the past, they had disappeared soon afterward. The only one who seemed to get away with it was Mishra, and he had several tons of dragon to support his argument. But Mishra only nodded and said, "We will need siege machinery. Nothing complex. Simple battering rams to assault the gates from all sides. That, in addition to a large amount of troops, should be enough." Hajar wondered, not for the first or last time, why Mishra did not simply use the power of the dragon engine to escape from the Qadir's petty tyranny, or to establish himself as Qadir. The former digger thought he knew the answer to that question. Though the Raki could overturn the Qadir and even maintain a core group of tribes to support him. But to what end? He had no apparent desire to rule over an empire or even over a small part of one. He would rather be the power behind the throne. Hajar was still turning these matters over in his mind as he and Mishra walked back to the Raki's tent, located on the outskirts of the encampment, on the off chance that the Raki might summon more dragons in the dead of night. Mishra was quiet, as he always was after one of the Qadir's explosions. A guard stood outside of the Raki's tent, which was unusual. More unusual, the brazier within was already lit, and the tent issued a warm, inviting glow. "Visitor," said the guard. His accent was atrocious, and Hajar immediately pegged him as one of the Westerners from the tribes around Tomikul. "It is late," said Mishra. The guard shrugged. "Does the Qadir know?" asked Mishra, earning another shrug. Hajar felt his irritation rise at the guard. What good is a guard who doesn't guard anything? Is this the kind of man to whom we are trusting our empire? "I see," said Mishra without apparent anger. "Go back to your duties." The man gave a gold-toothed smile and faded back into the darkness. Mishra stepped into his tent, regarding the interloper. "I've been expecting you," he said, much to Hajar's surprise. "I'm glad you made yourself at home in my absence." The visitor was a woman, among the most cruelly beautiful women Hajar had ever seen. Red hair was rare in the desert and was taken as an evil omen among the Suwadi. Hers was the red of a flickering camp flame. It rolled over her shoulders in thick, wavy curls. Her eyes were the grey-green of the sea that lapped Zegan's shores, and just as stormy. She was dressed in mannish armor of the Outlander style, but the armor had been cut and shaped more to favor her figure than to offer any real protection. Hajar realized he had stopped breathing. He inhaled deeply and wondered if she had noticed. She was reclining on Mishra's pillows, and she stretched as he entered. "I was expected?" she asked. Her voice was soft but carried a razor's edge with it. "You or someone like you," replied Mishra calmly. "You represent Zegan's rulers, and you're going to propose a deal to save your city." "I don't remember telling anyone that but the guard I bribed," said the woman. "If he told you, I'll have to have him killed." "Not to worry," returned Mishra. "He will be punished enough for letting an outlander into camp, regardless of the bribe. He will be made an example of, and in the end he will wish you had killed him. May I offer you some nabis?" "Please," said the woman, and Mishra motioned for Hajar to put a ewer of wine on the brazier. He sat down opposite the woman and waited for her to begin. Instead, she stared at Hajar. "Your manservant," she said coldly. Hajar bridled at the insult. "He is my bodyguard," said Mishra. "He should not be here," said the woman shortly. "Go," said Mishra to Haja, still staring intently at the woman. Haja began to protest, but Mishra cut him off. "Go to your tent. Tell no one. If I need anything, I will shout." Haja wavered a moment and looked at Mishra. The Argivian revealed nothing but merely watched the woman sitting among his pillows. He seemed as he was with the Qadir, thought Haja, closed and unapproachable. The Falagi sighed deeply and bowed, then backed out of the tent. His face marked his disapproval. "You are right, of course," said the woman as soon as Haja had left. "I have been empowered by the rulers of Zegon to negotiate on the behalf with the Falagi invaders." "But you are not Zegoni," observed Mishra. A small smile played across the woman's face. "And you are not Falagi." "I am Mishra, Raki of the Suwardi," returned Mishra. "I am Ashnod," said the woman, "of nothing in particular." "Is Zegon your home?" asked Mishra, running a hand over the rim of the metal ewer. The nabas was almost ready. "I did not say that," answered Ashnod. "And you are loyal to them?" inquired the Raki. "I did not say that either," responded Ashnod. "I merely told you they empowered me to speak on the behalf." They agreed quite readily. "I'm afraid some of them feel that if I make a muck of things and get myself killed, they can forswear me and will breathe more easily." "And the offer you are presenting is?" inquired the Argivian, reaching for the heavy metal cups. Ashnod cocked her head for a moment, then said, "Just a moment." She reached down to the floor at the base of the pillows and brought up a long staff. It was made of black thunderwood and was topped by a tangle of copper wires and the narrow skull of some sea creature. She raised the staff quickly and pointed it at the doorway. Ashnod barked a string of words, and the tangle of copper wires sang a discordant song. Wisps of lightning raced along the tracery of wires and into the skull itself. The staff lurched a fraction in her hand, but Mishra saw no obvious beam or other discharge. He did see the effect. Just outside the tent entrance, Haja gave a choked scream and fell into view, clutching his chest. Mishra was on his feet at once, crossing the tent and kneeling beside his bodyguard. Haja twitched as he stooped beside him. "So cold," managed the Falagi. "It feels so cold." "We were to be left alone," said Ashnod stonily. She lowered the staff. Her forehead was damp with perspiration. "I hate it when underlings cannot follow orders." The chill wave of nausea passed through Haja, and slowly the world righted itself. He gasped. "She did this." "She did," agreed Mishra, helping his bodyguard to his feet. "Because you disobeyed an order. I told you to go to your tent." "But go now, old friend," said Mishra. Haja looked at the young man, and there was nothing. No, there was the faint trace of a smile on his face. Mishra was pleased by Haja's loyalty. No, thought the bodyguard, there was more to it than that. He was pleased by something the woman had done. He was pleased Ashnod had attacked the bodyguard with her witch staff. Haja pulled himself to his feet. "And Haja," said Mishra. Haja turned. "Thank you for not screaming too loudly," said the Argivian. Again the ghost of a smile. "I want to talk to our guest before any guards arrive," he said. "Now go." Haja stumbled into the night. Mishra watched him disappear. in the darkness before turning back. Ashnod had taken the opportunity to pour the nabbers into its brass cups and was reclining on the pillows again, looking as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The skull-tipped staff was back at the base of the pillows. Mishra took his own cup and sat down opposite her. Then he laughed. It started as a small chuckle, descended into a chortle, then moved into a full-fledged belly laugh. At length he offered his cup in a toast and said, "That was very foolish." Ashnod looked indignant and did not raise her cup in response. "He was spying on us and disobeyed your order." Mishra took a long pull on the nabbers and chuckled again. "No. Not attacking Haja. But by attacking him the way you did, you tipped your hand." Ashnod gave him a cross look, and Mishra smiled. The woman noted it was a warm grin, without malice, and relaxed for the moment. "That staff," Mishra said. "You made it?" "Yes," she replied. Mishra nodded to himself and smiled again. "That's what is keeping the dragon engine at bay, isn't it?" The guards along Zegan's walls held similar staves. "You made the staves and told the Zegoni rulers they could keep the great evil fallagy away for the city." Slowly Ashnod nodded. "Your engine is a big target," Mishra continued, "but your staves have a flaw. They take a lot out of the user." Ashnod was silent. "After using it only briefly, you are sweating," added Mishra. Ashnod grunted. "Men sweat. Women glow. You were glowing like a horse after a hard race then." Mishra chuckled. "And if the city guards were similarly affected, they would be debilitated. The rulers of Zegon would not be pleased by that." Ashnod snorted. "The rulers were all too quick to adopt my staves for the defense," she said. "Once the guards started to weaken from their use, those same rulers panicked and sent you into the desert to sue for peace," added Mishra. "They probably said it was your idea that encouraged them to resist, so it was your fault." "You've met the Zegoni before," said Ashnod, a small smile crossing her lips as well. "I've dealt with the type in many forms," said Mishra, leaning back. "So tell me, what do they want?" "Bare minimum." Ashnod took a deep breath. "Tomical's deal. They surrender, pay some tribute, recognize your boy as ultimate leader, and get back to their lives." Mishra considered. "Sounds reasonable. Not to say that the Qadir will be reasonable. After all, you did stop us in our tracks, if only temporarily. I'll see what I can do." The Argivian set his cup down. "Now let me see your toy." Ashnod leaned forward and hefted the staff. She looked into Mishra's eyes for a moment, as if trying to determine what malice, if any, lay within. Then she handed the staff to him. The Falajiraki turned the staff over in his hands. "I see. Some Thran influences, but this is new. How does it work?" "It affects the nerves of the body," replied Ashnod. "The lightning in the staff upsets the body's mechanism that allows one to feel and distinguish pain. Too much upset, and the target is incapacitated. At the range of your dragon engine, it was not severely affected, but it would come no closer." "Nerves," said Mishra, nodding and tapping the small power crystal that had been set within the staff's skull. "Right," agreed Ashnod, setting her cup down and leaning forward. "The body has all manner of systems within it. Living tubes for blood, soft wires for nerves, strands of cable for muscle." She reached out, touching Mishra's arm. He did not flinch or pull away. You are no book scholar. Your arms are like spun steel. Life in the desert is hard, said Mishra softly. I never thought of the body as a machine. It is the best machine, said Ashnod, releasing his arm. Tested in the field, continually growing and self-replicating. Once we understand the mysteries of our own bodies, we understand the world. Everything else will fall into place. Your dragon engine is a wonder, but it is a crude imitation of living things. Mishra chuckled. This is the first red conversation I've had in a long while. Ashnod curled up amongst the pillows. There is a lack of intellectual companionship among the falange. Mishra laughed and leaned forward. Most of the conversations I've had with the swoop are along the lines of "you give me that" in various forms, followed closely by "you are what are me." Single quote. The young man chuckled again and set down the staff. I hadn't considered the body as a machine, but it makes sense. After all, we create things in our own image. Perhaps the Thran did as well. He moved over and sat next to Ashnod. Ashnod leaned close. Mishra could smell her musky perfume, accented with the tang of drying sweat. It was a pleasant combination. I think I can convince the Qadir to accept your ruler's request, he said softly. I thought you could, said Ashnod. You seem very capable. There's that. Ashnod wondered if Mishra smiled at anyone else in that fashion. The Raki added, and the fact that our most revered one is still as impatient as a child. If he had to wait for reinforcements from Tomikul, he would explode from the delay. Of course, there is one other thing. Ashnod pulled away from him. One other thing. Mishra said, the Zigoni must be seen to pay for the token resistance. They must suffer more than Tomikul, which threw open its gates to us. We will need an additional guarantee. Guarantee? Asked Ashnod. The falange take hostages to encourage obedience, said Mishra. Surely taking their premier artificer would be sufficient. Ashnod's eyes became slits. And would I be a falange hostage or yours? Mishra smiled again, and there was a touch of maliciousness in the expression. The falange have little use for women, he said, beyond the basics. The basics do not include intelligent conversation. Correct? Inquired Ashnod. You have the general idea, returned her companion. You would be viewed more as something we are denying the Zigoni as opposed to something to benefit the tribe. Ashnod leaned forward and touched Mishra's cheek. Hostage is such a nasty word. How does assistant sound? Mishra's eyebrows raised for a moment, then settled again. Is that really what you came here for? Am I so transparent? She asked, coy once again. As glass, said Mishra and laughed. When would you like to begin your lessons? Lessons in the morning, said Ashnod in a throaty whisper. This evening we are alone. I don't think your bodyguard is coming back any time soon. Mishra smiled and closed the grate on the brazier. There were no more words that evening. In the morning it was announced that the city of Zigon, fearful of the great dragon engine, had joined the falange empire. Tribute would be paid, and obeisance made to the great and revered Qadir of the Suwadi, ever the first among equals. As terms of the surrender, the Zigoni agreed to remove the gates of the city so they could never stand in opposition to the falange again. And they gave up the best artificer, who joined the falange camp as the Raki's apprentice. If any of the Warriors felt uncomfortable about the presence of the cold-eyed woman with the cursed hair in their midst. They did not say so. At least not where the Raki could overhear. Soon afterward, word arrived that the Outlanders along the coast were making heavy raids into Fallagy lands, and the invasion force turned east again. Chapter 10. Corlys. The chief artificer had missed so many meetings of the Privy Council that his absence was no longer even commented upon. Roscoe was there as his official representative, but Kayla knew that Urza hardly spent any time talking to Roscoe anymore either. The chief artificer spent most of his time working with the new apprentice, Tawnos, who had lasted much longer than Roscoe had predicted, much to the clockmaker's chagrin. There was a new captain of the guard. The old one had finally retired to spend time with his horses and her children. The warlord chose this one himself, and the new captain mirrored many of the ruler's qualities. He was impulsive, decisive, and active. Patrolling the borders was not enough, this new captain said when he first rose to the position. The Yotians must secure a corridor to Tomikul itself in order to protect the caravans. Now the Privy Council picked through the rubble of that plan. Armed patrols to Tomikul encouraged even larger attacks from the desert nomads. Fallagy tribesmen were now raiding into the sword marches, which had been relatively free of such incursions since the warlord had driven the native tribes out in his youth. Yosha did not have the manpower to both maintain its borders and guarantee safe passage to the desert capital. "We need to pull the plants out by the roots," said the new captain. "Go into the desert, find the Fallagy base, and crush it. If you can show me where it is and guarantee that it would still be there when we get there, I will gladly try," grumbled the warlord. "But the desert is like an ocean. Most of it is empty, and we do more damage to our own forces than to the Fallagy by taking the battle there. They are at home in the desert. We are not." "There are other ornithopters," said the captain. "We can scout the desert with them." "Still few in number," said Roscoe. "There are no more than 24 in all, and the chief artificer is wary of exposing them to the risk. We practically had to break his arm to convince him to allow them as scouts along the border." "And what of the search for more Thran stones?" asked the warlord. "Slow and tedious," said Roscoe. "There are raiders everywhere, and they seem to be able to smell out our exploration parties. Bok and Mibok preserve us. The Argivians have the same problem," stammered the seneschal. "They have been attempting to find more stones as well, but have met heavy resistance." The warlord stroked his chin. "Perhaps it is time to provide a unified front with the Argivians," hiccuped the seneschal. "And the coalitions as well," returned the warlord. "Perhaps it is time to bring the coastal nations together. Do you think a combined front offering peace could lure these savages out of their desert?" The captain sputtered for a moment, then said, "You think we should talk with those savages? After all the men we have lost?" "You're not listening," said the warlord patiently. "I asked if a combined front offering peace could lure their leaders into one place." The captain cocked his head to one side, then said, "Yes. Yes, I think it would." An ugly smile passed over his face. "They would be more likely to accept the invitation," added the seneschal, "if it were extended by the merchants of Corlys, who do not share a border with the Fallagy," finished the captain, "and as such pose no immediate threat And the coalitions, added the warlord thoughtfully, want to get their own ornithopters, which both we and the Argivians have. This would be an excellent opportunity for them to gain them, should they get the Falange leaders to the table. The warlord chuckled and the captain joined his merriment. For Kayla, entirely too much was unsaid. The men masked their thoughts with a cover of words. "So we are talking peace with the Falange?" she asked. "Yes," replied her father, his face suddenly somber. "We are talking peace. But we will also make sure we talk from a position of strength." He thumped the table with the flat of his hand. "Meeting adjourned. Good Sir Roscoe, I want you to stay and update me on your," he glanced at Kayla, "special project." The captain and seneschal left, speaking animatedly about the diplomatic requirements for the proposed gathering. Kayla departed as well, her metal heels sliding softly against the marble floor. Something else had happened at the table, something she was present for but not privy to. Previous conversations had been enigmatically concluded in her presence. It boiled down to one thing: she thought Daddy was up to something. Even though she was a grown woman, he still sought to spare her certain harsh facts about the world, her mother's death, the plans for her marriage, anything that smacked of secrets, battle, or hardship for others. He was up to something now. Of that Kayla had no doubt. And it involved Roscoe, but not her husband. Despite herself, her footsteps took her toward the ornery. She found her husband and the broad-shouldered Tawnos alone in the domed room. They had dismissed the remainder of the students for the day. Tawnos was stripped to the waist and bending a thick spar of candlewood along a graceful line chalked against one wall. Kayla knew enough to recognize it as a wing support for one of the ornithopters. The tall toymaker grunted with the effort, and his muscles bulged as he bent the spar to match the chalk line exactly. "Hold it," said Urza, dropping beneath Tawnos's grip and wiring the newly curved section back to the ornithopter's main spine. "Now bend it the other way." Tawnos gasped and twisted the beam in the other direction, forming an S-shaped curve. Kayla was impressed. Candlewood was light, but the spar the young man was manhandling was the thickness of her wrist. And, she thought, Tawnos looked very good, stripped to the waist. "Husband, we need to talk," Kayla said. Urza quickly held up a hand and waved it slightly, but Kayla would not be dissuaded. "No, we need to talk." Urza looked up at his assistant. "Go ahead. I'll wait," said Tawnos through clenched teeth. Urza turned toward his wife. His hair had gone entirely white, probably, thought Kayla, due to the amount of work he'd been doing. He was dressed in the heavy leather smock that had practically become his second skin over the years. "I'm sorry, dear," he said, "but I am very busy." "You are always very busy," snapped Kayla, "except when you are sleeping. And even then you seem restless." She relented and held out a hand to stroke his cheek. Urza flinched slightly at the touch. He reached up and gently took her hand. "It's just that we may have a way to improve the diving speed of the ornithopters. Tawnos has suggested that if we truly shape the spar to resemble a predatory bird's wing, then it would be more maneuverable as well." Kayla nodded and pushed his words aside unconsidered. "I think father is planning something." Urza sighed and looked at his assistant. Tawnos gave a good-natured nod, but his veins were standing out at his neck from holding the candlewood spar in its twisted position. To Kayla, Urza said, "Your father is always planning something. That's what he does best." The princess sighed and shook her head. "It's not that. He wants to negotiate with the fallagy leaders and to get the Argivians and coalitions involved as well." "That's good," said Urza abstractedly, watching the way the wings lined up against the chalk mark on the wall. "Most of the fallagy I've known have been rational men, even if there are problems with the caravans and a few hot-headed leaders. And your father is too sharp to let Argivians get away with anything." "What's the problem?" "He never wanted to talk to the fallagy before," Kayla said. "People change." Urza shrugged, his eyes never leaving the line of the wing. "You don't," thought Kayla, but instead she said, "I don't. No. I just think something is wrong with this situation." Urza looked at Kayla and sighed deeply. "Your father is a reasonable man. An old warhorse, but a reasonable man. There are reasonable men among the fallagy, even among the Argivians. I'm sure things will work out." "Master Urza," called Tawnos. "It's beginning to slip a little. I have to go," said Urza. He turned back to the spar. "But what about?" began his wife. Urza held up a hand as he walked away. "Your father wants peace." "Sounds good." They were a little odd. Argivians involved. "Probably he'll tell you what's going on eventually." There was the sound of a metal-heeled foot stomping the floor behind him, and the brisk clatter of heels storming out of the room. It ended in a resounding slam of the ornery doors. "What was that about?" asked Tawnos, sweat streaming down his face. "I'm not quite sure," returned Urza. "Kayla worries about her father too much. Bend the wings a little more convex there. That's it. Now, hold it." The announcement was made the following month. Representatives of Argive, Yosha, and Kaulos were to meet in Kaulos to discuss the problems with the desert raiders. Runners were sent under a flag of truce to Tomikul, Zigon, and other fallagy towns to invite the Qadir of the Suwardi to attend as well. Safe conduct was promised to all attendees. The coastal nations selected not Kaulos's main city itself as the site for the meeting, but rather an outpost town, Kaulinda, located farther up the Kor River on the haunches of the Kh ridges themselves. Should the fallagy appear, the warlords said, they would have less distance to travel. Kayla thought there was another purpose behind the location. The fallagy would be far for the traditionally claimed land, and the civilized nations would have ample warning of how large the party was before it arrived. Urza was pried loose from his ornery only by the announcement that 2 of his older ornithopters would be provided as a gift to the people of Kaulos. A full force of 12 winged machines would appear at the meeting, and 2 would be left behind. After Urza complained that he would have to be present to tell the Caulician how to maintain the ornithopters, the warlord graciously extended an invitation to the artificer. Knowing he had been outmaneuvered, Urza protested no further, but instead worked out a schedule that provided for a minimum amount of time away from his shop. The warlord and his entourage would leave early. He would follow with the ornithopters 5 days before the session began. He also left detailed instructions for Tawnos and the students to follow while he was gone. Tawnos thought at the time that Urza spent more time detailing the tasks that needed to be done in his absence than the tasks themselves. would take, but he merely nodded when the chief artificer handed over the ream of parchment. Urza's metal humanoid would also be sent out to the meeting, but would go by wagon. Rusko was in charge of this move and used one of the spring-axled wagons Urza had developed the previous year. The clockmaker was particularly interested in a vehicle that would not rock excessively, though Urza pointed out that his metal creation could walk to Tawnos and probably make better time than Rusko would. Rusko, for his part, invoked a number of Yotian and non-Yotian deities and insisted he did not want to have to come back and tell the artificer that his great creation had been lost due to a broken limb assembly or had been spotted by farmers while walking through eastern Tawnos and accidentally dismantled. In the end, Tawnos was left behind with the school. Kayla remained behind as well. The warlord cited the dangers of travel, even through friendly lands. He needed her and the seneschal, he said, to remain behind and run the country in his absence. He did, however, take the captain of the guard with him. The royal party left at Midsummer's Day, and Urza left 20 days later with his flight of ornithopters. The natives of Krug threw celebrations at the drop of a plumed hat, and both departures were filled with much pomp and cheering. The warlord rode out at the head of his royal caravan, mounted on a powerful horse, the descendant of ones he had ridden in his great war triumphs. For many of the natives of Krug, that was how he would always be remembered, astride his stallion in full armor, cantering at the head of his forces. Yet even that departure paled before the celebration when Urza and the ornithopters took off. They had cleared the palace's great court for the departure, and for the week before Urza camped on the site with his craft. He double-checked every strut and spar and made sure there were sufficient spare parts to cover every eventuality. Tawnos mentioned to Kayla that they were carrying enough components to knit an additional ornithopter if need be. The crowd started gathering as the week progressed, watching Urza move between the machines, checking figures with Tawnos, testing and retesting wires, and going over charts and schedules. An electric thrill mounted as the crowd swelled. All had seen the ornithopters before. They were a common sight in the skies over Krug. Yet never had the citizens seen so many together at once. On the morning of the departure, Kayla appeared to wish her husband well. The crowds watched the couple embrace and imagined quiet, tender words spoken between them. Then Urza gave the signal to Tawnos. Tawnos in turn waved to the rest of the flight to prepare the crafts as Urza climbed into his ornithopter's white housing. As one, the ornithopter pilots engaged the power stones, and the great wing devices came to life. Slowly they pumped their air, limbering up the wings that had been carefully prepared and preened for days previously. A wave of applause swept through the gathered crowd. A few of the pilots waved from the windows, bringing another, louder round of clapping. Then the beating of the wings intensified. Urza's craft, the one with the double curved wings, took a little hop, and then suddenly was airborne, as effortlessly as a bird in flight. The two ornithopters behind it took similar hops, and they were aloft as well. Then the two behind those joined in the flight. In turn, each pair of ornithopters arose from the courtyard like a flock of startled doves. The assembled citizens of Krug cheered as they took to the sky. The ornithopters took a long, leisurely arc around the palace of Krug, beating wings to gain altitude, and the crowd yelled itself roar as they did so. The people waved pennants and threw the small smoke poppers that had become popular of late. Some climbed the higher spires and waved great flags. The ornithopters locked their wings and gave a wing dip in response to the shouting populace. Then they were gone, dancing into the morning sun. The people watched him until they were lost from sight, until other buildings or the low hills to the east blocked their view, or, for those who had climbed the spears when the ornithopter fleet had become small, indistinct dots on the horizon. A few watched the princess, however, and some claimed that her eyes were wet and that she dabbed them with her kerchief. As she turned back to her palace, the seneschal at her side. In the days and months that followed, some would say she had wept because her husband was leaving her. Some would say it was because she had dreamed what was about to happen and knew she could not change it. And some would say that she knew that the end of her small part of the world and the destruction of Krug would begin at the Council of Corlys. The machines performed remarkably well, and took only 4 days to make the trip to Korlinda. Urza had ordered Roscoe to set up a series of base camps between Krug and Korlinda as the clock maker pushed eastward with the wagons. All the camps were in Yotian territory and in clear terrain. Each was fully operational by the time Urza's ships reached it, ready with soft beds and hot meals for the pilots after they had completed the day's flying. The weather was clear and pristine, and even the storms that regularly lashed the southeastern coast of Tawnos seemed to have gone on holiday. Urza had allowed for an extra day of flying time in case of heavy thunderstorms, which normally roosted in the southern Cares, but there was not so much as a heavy ground fog for the entire trip. Indeed, the most difficult problem the pilots faced was the Yotians themselves. At every base camp, a collection of spectators assembled, all curious about the chief artificer and his mighty machines. They clustered around the fields, waiting for the craft, and on occasion the ornithopters would be forced to pass close over the crowd in order to disperse them and create a large enough site on which to land. One of the pilots observed it was like herding sheep, but he said it too close to the chief artificer. That pilot spent the rest of the flight in the rear of the formation and did not speak again for the rest of the trip. And once they had landed, there were requests for favors in particular for rides. Urza at first refused, but the pilots, even after a full day at the controls, were willing to volunteer the time to take young children and teenagers aloft. Finally Urza gave his assent, but made clear he was not going to provide rides himself or allow anyone to fly his white craft with the double curved wings. The pilots had all been chosen by Roscoe, who said he had done so to save Urza time. They were at least 5 years Urza's junior, and had an enthusiasm the artificer did not remember having possessed at the same age. The majority were known for stunt flying, for pushing the crafts as far as they could go, and several had walked away from nasty crack-ups. Urza would have chosen those with a better technical background and a higher safety rating, but he knew anyone properly vetted and trained could be a suitable pilot for the ornithopters. Indeed, during this trip, even the most cavalier of the young men flew dead level and kept in formation with Urza's ornithopter for the entire journey. The site that had been chosen for the council was near the meeting point of the 3 civilized nations of eastern Tawnos, where the river tumbled from the Cares into the first of several level plateaus stepping down to the shielded sea, was a suitable spot. It was also connected at the point with an anomalous sliver of no man's land, an undulating strip that followed the inhospitable peaks of the K8 ridges, as yet unofficially claimed by any side in the dispute. The site was a huge level field with a great open-air pavilion erected in the center over a raised platform. 4 other camp areas surrounded the central pavilion, one for each of the attendees. When Urza arrived, 3 sides of the square had been complete. The warlords' Yotians formed the western side of the square, the mercantile coalitions were to the south, and the Argivians occupied the eastern side. The space to the north of the pavilion was empty. That had been reserved for the Phalagi, though none knew if they would appear. Urza set down his ornithopter to the west, near the Yotian camp. The other pilots followed with military precision. Each ornithopter swooped, hovered for a moment on back-pushing wings, then settled in place. There were no crowds here, no rush of commoners hoping to catch a glimpse of the chief artificer and his pilots. The Yotians were familiar with ornithopters, and the representatives of the 2 other nations feigned disinterest for purely political reasons. If Urza had hoped to meet any of Takasia's former students among the Argivian delegation, he was disappointed. The Argivians were, to a man, bureaucrats and diplomats with strong connections to the Argivian king. Argivian politicians considered that the artifact-hunting scholars and the supporting nobles held radical views in the matter of the Phalagi, namely that the desert should be free and open for Argivian exploration.